Well, good evening, everybody. It's been 2 weeks since I've been here. I was traveling back from Denver last weekend, so Angela held down the fort. But a lot has happened this last week. On Saturday, we got the nomination from the Green Party. So now we're the ticket of both the Green and Socialist parties, and we're going for some state independent progressive party nominations that are still to come. We also qualified for federal primary matching funds, which is basically going to double the 200,000 we've raised so far, which we're going to pour back into ballot access so we can get on all the ballots and provide a real alternative to Trump and Biden. And following the convention, we had a well-attended national organizing meeting, getting people organized into the campaign. We did a news conference. We're now bilingual. We had Spanish translation. We got a Spanish media coordinator. And we made the news. I've been in the New York Times 2 days in a row, and it wasn't bad. The Washington Post, Politico a couple times. And you know what they're saying is what I've been saying. You know, where the hell is Joe Biden to deal with this COVID pandemic? We know Trump is a loser. He doesn't know what the hell he's doing. But Biden, who can command the White House press corps, he can commute right down there like he did when he was a senator, is AWOL. And you've seen the graphs. They're exploding, the infections, and the deaths are coming. And we're in the midst of a real crisis. So like I say, the two governing parties in this country are presiding over a failed state. And the COVID pandemic's made that clear for everyone to see. The response to the uprising against police brutality and racism, same thing. They don't have answers. And then when we started this campaign, it was about 3 life or death issues they don't have answers to. The climate meltdown, the inequality crisis with working class life expectancies in decline because we've had 50 years of stagnant wages and growing economic inequality, and this new nuclear arms race that none of the other presidential candidates are talking about. And we plan to make that a top campaign issue because that's an existential threat as well. So it's been an eventful week, and we got, I forget how many days left. It's like 140 days till the election. So now we're going after Trump and Biden. What do you want to say, Angela, before we start answering questions?
Pretty much. I mean, I think that it's important for people to understand that when we talk about we are running to get the White House, there's a lot of imperative here. We as a species we're running out of time. Climate change is not something that can continue to be kicked down the road for the next generation. There won't be a next generation if we continue with business as usual. And that's something that's been very heavy on my mind today. So, there's a lot of urgency about, with this campaign and with getting into a position where we can start reversing climate change and change the way that we are living in this planet.
So CHAR, West Virginia, I assume that's what WV stands for. I've been waiting on this. Trump was bad-mouthing the Green New Deal. I hope Howie speaks to that tonight. Yeah, Trump says he knows everything about everything, but he knows nothing about anything that matters, including the Green New Deal. Trump calls climate change a hoax. I mean, he doesn't believe science. Climate change is real, just like that coronavirus pandemic is real. So, our goal with the Green New Deal is to do what the climate science carbon budgets say we have to do in the rich countries like the United States, and that is zero out greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, go to 100% clean energy. And in this coronavirus economic crash, we need a program for economic recovery as well as climate recovery. And the Green New Deal does that because our plan, which you can look at the details on the website, howiehawkins.us, calls for $27.5 trillion 10-year investment in rebuilding all our productive systems to reach those goals of zero emissions and 100% clean energy. And in the process, it creates 38 million jobs. which is what we need now. When we unveiled that budget last fall, we recognized that the bottleneck was labor. We didn't have enough people to do all the work we need to do in the next 10 years. Well, now with the destruction of the economy because of the lockdown, and now we're starting to go back into it in some states, we have something for people to do when we reopen. And we got to do that safely. I mean, that's the other issue. Wasn't part of the Green New Deal when we started, but we've got to test, contact trace, isolate the people who are infected, suppress the community spread of the virus, and then we can reopen safely like they've done on the Pacific Rim, most European countries, most organized societies around the world. And when they do get a flare up, they shut right down and take care of it. In this country, we're like going ahead. You know, I'm calling Trump Typhoid Mary. He's going around having super spreader rallies, making his own staff as well as supporters sick. The guy's a menace. So I don't expect Trump to say anything intelligent about the Green New Deal. He's going to call it socialist and he's going to blame Biden. He can't even tell a socialist from a corporate conservative. We're the socialists here. But, you know, Trump is really kind of a dummy. So I don't know what else to say about Trump and the Green New Deal. What do you want to say, Angela?
Nothing you haven't already said. I'm surprised you could pronounce it. The Falcon General. What is your criminal justice reform policy? Well, one of our policies, and we hesitate to call it reform because we understand that this is not a system that can be reformed. It is inherently racist. It is inherently capitalist, and we're not coming at the issue of how we handle people in a holistic way. And so one of the ways that we will address, that we're looking at addressing the crisis of mass incarceration in this country is to offer an economic bill of rights. So you have communities that we're able to raise the I hate to say this too because it's so overused, but level out the playing field economically so that you don't have people being criminalized for being houseless. You don't have people being criminalized for marijuana or, drug use. We would treat drug use as a health issue instead of a criminal issue because it is a health issue and not a criminal issue. Decriminalizing sex work and following the New Zealand model where, as long as it is two consenting adults making this transaction, law enforcement has nothing to do with it. And also, in our economic bill of rights, making sure that there is a guaranteed income for all above poverty and that we are, being holistic I think is what I'm trying to say, being holistic in the way that we address what we consider crime in this country. Because if you think about it, what we're asking police to do in this country, most of it is not within their purview. 5% of what police are called to is actually violent crime where they would be useful. When you're having issues with, there's mental health episodes, there's substance use episodes, people are houseless, sex work, things like that. Those things are not criminal. And so we need to have, an investment when we're talking about community control of police and reallocating funds from both police and military budgets back to the infrastructure of our community so that we can provide wraparound services for the people who need them. And we are not loading up jails with people who don't belong there. And Howie, you might want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, the decriminalization of drugs is really important because that's what's driven mass incarceration. 45% of federal prisoners are in there for drug offenses. And we want to decriminalize like they did in Portugal, where, first of all, we want to just legalize, regulate, and tax marijuana. It's less harmful than alcohol and tobacco, and they're legal. And that's the best way to handle that substance. And then there are harder drugs, which are more dangerous, but to make them a criminal problem instead of a health problem just makes the problem worse. We have an opioid epidemic and many deaths, and people who maybe get an opioid because they had an operation and they get addicted, and then they're out on the street getting heroin, and they're getting, fentanyl in the heroin, and they die from an overdose because they won't go seek help because they're using heroin, which is a criminal problem. So they end up dying. You decriminalize that, like what they did in Portugal. If you're in possession of hard drugs for personal use, you get a ticket and you show up at a hearing. It's a meeting with a lawyer, a doctor, and a social worker. And they look at your situation and see how they can help. Are you using drugs to cope with psychological problems, economic problems? How can they help with that? Are you addicted? You need drug treatment. And what they found, and they instituted this, I think it was 2001, is that they don't have overdoses. They have very little drug crime. And actually less people use the hard drugs than before. So that's a harm reduction approach that I think we need to take, and that will reduce the mass incarceration. And then people who are in for nonviolent drug offenses should be released. And those that need drug treatment, that should be provided. And that will empty the jails or reduce the number of people jailed by a large amount. Another part of crime that we don't talk about, but it actually costs us more, far more than street crime, is corporate crime. When under the Obama administration, Black America lost half its wealth because these banksters were stealing their homes, predatory lending and foreclosures, and then the robo-signing, which was like computerized fraud. And instead of prosecuting those criminals, the Obama administration, as Eric Holder summarized it, is the way that Wall Street Journal summarized his testimony in the beginning of the second Obama term, was they're too big to jail. These people got away because it was just too hard for the Justice Department to bring them to justice. And where are they now? Well, two of their leading corporate criminals are running Commerce and Treasury departments. Commerce is Wilbur Ross, who owned a lot of the mortgage servicing companies that did all that robo-signing. And Mnuchin was involved in the robo-signing, but his big thing through One West was predatory lending and foreclosures, targeting Black and Latino and Asian homeowners in California. And so corporate crime, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. People die because workplaces aren't safe, products aren't safe, pollution is released that causes cancer and asthma and other problems. And right now we've got an administration that's just gutting all those regulations and preventing those agencies from doing their jobs. And so that's serious crime. And I can't remember the monetary numbers, but it's orders of magnitude more is lost by us as consumers and as people who go to work and live in this society and suffer the pollution than is lost from street crime. And then just one more reform I think we should have, and that is public defenders. We need federal funding for public defenders. They should be paid at the same level as the prosecutors in their jurisdictions. And there should be enough public defenders so everybody can have a trial if they think they deserve one. Right now, over 95% of people charged with crimes take plea bargains, not because they're all guilty, but because a lot of them know that if they take it to trial and they lose, it'll be much worse than if they cop a plea bargain. And there's so many people that have been forced to do that just because they can't defend themselves. So one of the criminal justice reforms we need is a real system of public defenders so that your Fourth Amendment rights to a fair trial are protected. Carrie Converse asked, what is your stance on Social Security? Well, number one, we're not going to cut it for so-called fiscal responsibility, like both Biden and Trump have at various times said they would. In fact, we want to double Social Security benefits so that every senior lives above the poverty line. And there's a guy that he was a Green, I'm not sure he still is, but Stephen Hill wrote a whole book about this about 10 years ago. And there were articles in the Atlantic magazine on how we could pay for this. And, the first thing is we end the cap on the Social Security tax. It's now just a little over $130,000. So if you're making a high salary above 130,000, you don't pay that Social Security tax that the rest of us pay on all the money you make over 130,000. So that would contribute a lot to the Social Security fund and enable this doubling of benefits. And that should be a public pension plan that everybody has access to. You know, the boomer generation has lived through a period when wages were stagnant, housing, healthcare, and college costs have gone through the roof. So they raised their families, they did what they're supposed to do, and now they're retiring without savings. And Social Security levels leave them in poverty. And that's just not right. You want to add anything, Angela?
I think you're pretty comprehensive on that one.
All right.
Nathan Shields. How can we help other voters differentiate between the socialist platform of the Green Party and the concept of state socialism, that the Green Party has actively rejected? This is a dang good question. Well, my answer is always issues. How and our structure, as far as for us, socialism, the way that we understand socialism to be, socialism is true democracy. Everyone has a say in what is produced. Everyone has a say in the services that are in their communities. Everyone has a say in how things are administered, where they go, things like that. And so I think, you know, the authoritarian concept of socialism that a lot of people have, just telling them true socialism is a democracy, and it is not an authoritarian government, top down, you do what you're told. That's not true socialism. Socialism is a democracy. Howie, what do you have on that?
Yeah, the Green Party makes that distinction because we're not talking about, they called it state socialism in the old Soviet bloc and some other one-party states around the world, where instead of economic democracy, you really had a bureaucratic class exploiting, extracting the surplus from a working class, which really didn't have much say in the enterprise. Independent trade unions really weren't in existence, so they couldn't strike or bargain with their employer, which was the state. So our idea of socialism is, first of all, democracy within the firm, whether it's in the public sector as a public enterprise or in the private sector as a cooperative. And then democracy in society. So when we plan the economy in the public enterprises, the public sector, the people have a say. So for example, when we talk about a public energy system, we're talking about locally elected public energy boards that do the detailed planning in the communities for where we're headed is a renewable, clean energy system. And then those boards elect people to state and national boards to coordinate the overall planning. We talk about the same thing when we say our Medicare for All will expand from national health insurance, which simply pays for the medical expenses, to a national health service, in which the hospitals and clinics are publicly owned, the doctors and the nurses and all the healthcare workers are salaried public employees, and the whole system is governed by locally elected health boards. In this case, we would have them 2/3 elected by the public, but 1/3 by the workers. So the workers would have a say and bring their expertise to those health boards. And of course, in a cooperative, it's the members who decide. In a worker cooperative, it's the workers. In a consumer cooperative, it's the people that use it's usually a retail enterprise or a credit union. And they're not exploited because all the surplus is distributed to the members in proportion to their contribution to the enterprise. So that's very different than you have when you have a big state bureaucracy and centralized administration, which the Medicare system we have right now, frankly, is, I guess you could call it state socialist. It's at least partially socialized payment of medical services, but we still got to pay premiums. I'm on Medicare, I'm paying premiums, and I get out-of-pocket expenses, and I get deductibles. And I have a beef with Medicare about my payments. I think I'm paid up, they think I'm not. And I get a telephone tree. in the kind of democratic socialism we're talking about, there's a local board, and I'll know who those people are. And because we elected, we're going to have some real people we can talk to, and not just the telephone tree and robots. So I think that sort of brings it down to the ground level. What the kind of socialism we're talking about is compared to what has been called socialism, but really didn't live up to our standards. And I'll just say one more thing about that. I don't think we can point to any society yet we could call socialist, but a lot of us have participated in socialist institutions. Our credit union. We may live in a city, town, or village that has a municipal power company, and they tend to provide better power at lower cost by about 15% than the investor-owned utilities, the private capitalist utilities. So a lot of us think socialism is an alien idea, and we've been living in it, at least for part of our lives. Basically, Ruth says or asks, what do you think about giving land back to indigenous Americans? If it's in the treaties, yes. I don't know what else to say. The treaties are supposed to be equal in status to our Constitution, their relationship with other sovereign nations. And there's been land taken as well, services we're obligated to provide under the treaties that we're not. So we say honor the Indian treaties. I don't know if you want to add anything, Angela, to that.
I'm just thinking of the most recent ruling from the Supreme Court in Oklahoma about, the restoration of land to indigenous nations. And yeah, it's what's supposed to happen. This land belongs to the indigenous people who were here before us, and there need to be reparations made for what has been done to them. So we support it. Belsima, what can one do? And I saw this earlier in the chat. What can one do for the Greens or the Socialist Party of the USA if there's none in their area and they're looking to help? Or even if there is one, how can one help / get involved? Well, with the Green Party, just talk to people. I mean, where are you and who, who can you get in touch with? And also, I think, I was gonna say you can reach out to us. And because if you're somewhere and you don't know who to talk to, and where do I get in touch with people, I think their website might be helpful, but also, like, how do you find people? I just look for them, but that's me.
Yeah,
You're pro at this, Howie.
Yeah, I would suggest you can go to the websites of state Green parties, the Socialist Party USA, look for their chapters and see if there's one in your area and contact those people. And whether they're there or not, you should contact our campaign.
Yes, please.
Matter of fact, it's not bragging, it's just the way it is. We got more organizers and people involved right now than either party has at the national level to help. So I think a good way to begin building a local Green or Socialist and or both in your community is to get involved in the campaign, because we're going out, we're talking to voters, we're talking about people that support our platform, and you're getting a list of people, you're beginning to work with them. And as the campaign goes on and after the campaign, you can continue to work in your area. And that's really one of the major goals of our campaign. Mm-hmm. We want to organize a mass party of the left so that in the communities of the people that vote in low numbers, the working class people, the people of color, the young people, because they're alienated from the two parties that really don't speak to them, we want to build organizations where those people know us because we're there. We've talked to them, we've listened to them, and they trust us. So when issues come up, they look to us to help them deal with them. And that's how we're going to build this. So I think the campaign is a good way to, even if you do find a local Green or Socialist Party chapter in your area, we may have names they don't because people have independently contacted us. So go to the website, sign up, and an organizer will get in touch with you and help you, do that kind of organizing. to Stick Rocks. How will you address outsourcing of jobs over the last 25 years? Well, our Green New Deal is about rebuilding manufacturing in this country. We hardly have a machine tool industry left. And you need machine tools in order to build the machinery for intermediate goods and consumer goods. And what we want to do is have public and cooperative ownership of these Green New Deal factories, because we're going to need them to build all the new factories. We need whole new production systems. Like, if we're going to produce steel without releasing carbon, we got to replace coke ovens with electric arc furnaces. We've got to replace Portland cement with other kinds of cement. Portland cement, you put calcium carbonate and you heat it up and the calcium hardens the cement, but the carbonate goes into the atmosphere and accounts for 5% of the world's carbon footprint. And we go through all these technologies, we've got to rebuild them all. So we're going to build a self-reliant manufacturing base that is run on clean energy and minimizes waste. Our goal is zero waste. So we're extracting less from the earth and putting less back into the earth as waste. And so that's what we do. The reason these corporations, these global corporations, have been able to outsource jobs is that they're absentee owned. You know, I live in a town, Syracuse, New York, that was a factory town. 30, 40 years ago, GE had 27,000 jobs in their factories here. Now they're none. And factory after factory closed. One of the last to leave was Carrier. They went to China. When NAFTA opened up, there was a company that started here as a typewriter company, and it was producing more of the electronic gauge materials. They announced the day NAFTA passed, they're moving to Mexico. We had subsidies from New York State to a factory out in Western New York, and they built a factory in Mexico. When NAFTA opened up, they moved into, and that factory cost equal to the subsidies New York State was giving them to stay in business here. I mean, we've been so ripped off by that. And the problem is, and this is one of the problems of capitalism, we don't own the means of production that we use. It's owned by a small elite, and they could care less about us. And if they can make more money by going to low-wage markets overseas or over the border, they will do that. So that's the other thing we'll do. We will rebuild the economy based on public and cooperative ownership. So we will own our own jobs. It won't be this billionaire class that, you know, lets us work until they can find cheaper workers.
Finding Freedom 27. I can't talk tonight, y'all. Finding Freedom 17. What are your thoughts on educational curriculum nationally? It's a really good question. I personally believe that curricula should be appropriate to the communities that are using them. I understand that, you know, there's national standards, so they have to come up to that also. But I think that, you know, it should be something that is flexible per community. One of the things that when I did organizing around public education that I heard from a lot of educators is, you know, they had a lot of problems with Common Core and, you know, things that were kind of foisted on them. I think educators also should have a hand in the creation of curricula, as well as students, as well as, you know, families, caregivers, inputs, you know, the folks who are going to use those curricula. It shouldn't be something that comes from, you know, where they're told this is what you're going to teach and this is across the board. And, you know, I think a lot of what happens in our schools is young people are given material that doesn't speak to them. And then they're given these standardized tests, and then they're penalized because you didn't do well on this test. But this is not something they see themselves in. It's not relevant to them. And so I think that educators need to be able to have flexibility and input with the curricula that they're using. I think that community input is important for that. And that's just my take on it. Howie, what do you think about it?
Well, I agree. I think most of the curriculum should be developed locally by the teachers and the parents who care about their kids. I think we can count on that. They're going to do a good faith effort. The problem we have with the federal government imposing curriculums like Common Core and high stakes testing is there's another agenda there. And that was about the privatization of public education and, people making money off the charter industry. And they had special, it was called the New Markets Tax Credit. So they're making money off of property development and could double their money in 7 years. We had a case of that up here in Albany, New York, that Juan Gonzalez of the Daily News and Democracy Now! Exposed a decade ago. And, that was foisted on schools by both the Obama administration with Arne Duncan, who did a number on the Chicago schools, closed a lot of schools in the Black community. That was about property development, not education. And now with Betsy DeVos, it's off the charts. So I think the federal government, its role should be to provide funding. We would like to see an end to dependence on the property tax, which is unequally distributed between communities, and have progressive federal income and wealth taxes provide per capita funding to all the schools in the country at a level where we can reduce class sizes to down like 15-1, and then have some special funds for communities that need extra help because they've been impoverished and poorly educated for a long time. I think the federal government should encourage science. We have, not at the local level so much as at the state level, and particularly in the Bible Belt, they impose curricula that downplays things like evolution, and or you can't get sex education that you really need, to avoid diseases, avoid getting pregnant when you don't want to, that kind of thing, that, these people that in the Bible Belt just don't want the young people to know. And I think federal government has a role there setting guidelines. And so I think those are the things I would say about, the federal role in education. S.A. Duffy, could you speak on some peace initiatives you would support as president? War seems to be on the rise with Turkey's various invasions. The Dems trying to go to war with Russia and various others. Yeah, I'd be happy to start with that. One of the major parts of our platform is peace initiatives, because we're in a new nuclear arms race. It's very dangerous. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has moved their doomsday clock the closest it's ever been to midnight. The last treaty between the United States and Russia on nuclear arms expires next February 5th. And none of the major party presidential candidates have made this an issue. We want to make it a top issue in this campaign because it's a life or death issue for us. So our peace initiatives are cutting the military budget by 75%, bringing our troops home from these endless wars, pledging no first use of nuclear weapons, disarming to a minimum credible deterrent, and then going to the other nuclear powers and saying, we're no longer threatening you. We want peace. We want complete and mutual nuclear disarmament. And we go there with world public opinion and the support of the 122 nations that 3 years ago this week, agreed to a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. The International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons got the Nobel Peace Prize for that. And hardly anybody in our country knows that. And that is a real shame. It speaks to the absence of leadership by both major parties and how the mass media are just stenographers for the corporate two-party state. And they're not dealing with real issues. Now, you mentioned Turkey. Turkey's a menace. They invaded Syria twice. They're now in Libya. They have agreements with Russia in Syria, but they're fighting them. And then the same thing in Libya. It's like they're trying to rebuild the Ottoman Empire. And that's a problem. They're a NATO member, and we're in NATO. And NATO supposedly is an alliance for self-defense. But here's Turkey acting like a little imperialist And the US and the rest of NATO kind of shrugs. They're not stopping them. And, you know, there should have been consequences in terms of Turkey's relationship with the rest of NATO for that. So I think, you know, there's a lot we could do to discourage that kind of military aggression. And the first thing we can do is to stop doing it ourselves and set a good example. You know, I think of, you know, Trump saying we're going to put Juan Guaido in as president of Venezuela. I mean, he has no right to do that. And he puts him in the gallery at the State of the Union address. And when he acknowledges him, all the damn Democrats stand up and give him a standing ovation along with the Republicans. I mean, if there's one thing, there's a difference with the Green Party and the Democrats and Republicans is that we're anti-imperialist. We want to have good relations with the countries of the world. That doesn't mean we agree with everything they do within their countries. No way. But we got to deal with them. You know, Russia and China, we got to deal with them for nuclear disarmament, for getting out of this climate crisis, and for getting out of these proxy wars that, you know, we're conducting with Russia in places like the Ukraine and Syria. So you got to deal with the world as it is. And, you know, I always go back to Thomas Paine, a great revolutionary, internationalist. You know, he was in the American Revolution, the French Revolution. The Brits thought he was going to start one there, and they didn't treat him so well. And actually, when the revolution ended here and the planters and the merchants, you know, sort of got control, he was not a popular person when he died. But his idea of a good foreign policy is engage the world from your democratic republic with commerce and cultural exchange, and the ideas will take hold in the hearts of the people around the world, and that's how you support democracy and human rights. So setting a good example is the strongest thing we have to promote peace in the world.
Amy Morrissey, there are lots of rumors going around Twitter about corruption within the Green Party. Can you both please speak on that? Well,
I'll be brief. Look, we're running against Trump and Biden. There are people who lost the Green primaries. I'm sorry they got sour grapes, but we're focusing on Trump and Biden. They represent the two governing parties that are presiding over a failed state. And if people are serious about climate change and economic inequality and racism and this new nuclear arms race, they should get on board this campaign. We won the primary. The idea of corruption, look, there are some problems in the Green Party. We want to take care of them internally instead of going out and putting it all in the street on, you know, the internet. That's not serious politics. People doing that are dilettantes. And okay, I wasn't so brief, but that's my attitude about that.
That actually was brief, Howie. My thing is this: everybody. This is politics. Everybody's not going to like you. Everybody is not going to get along with you. There is a level of obnoxiousness that comes with this territory, which is something that we understand. The thing about it is judge by what we're doing. Are we giving content? Are we slinging crap? And that's not usually what I say. Are we offering solutions? Are the things that you're getting from us something that are useful to you? I think we've had enough of a sideshow with what is currently happening in the White House. I think people are tired of that. I think we're a little bit more intelligent than the whole bread and circuses thing. So some level of smearing is going to happen. Somebody, you know, doesn't get what they want. They get mad. This is what happens. We get it. We acknowledge it. We've spoken on it. Moving on.
Jack Norman Ross III, how do you feel about government subsidizing the meat and dairy industries? Well, I would say what we need in agriculture is a transition to regenerative organic agriculture. And all commodities, not just the usual ones that get subsidies now, like corn and soy, there should be a parity pricing floor beneath those commodities. And that basically means that as production costs go up, so does the parity price, which is a floor. And that would include dairy products. It would include meat, but it wouldn't be preferred over fruits and vegetables. All commodities would get that. And that will enable farmers to go back to the land, and instead of using pesticides and herbicides and chemical fertilizers, to restore the soil, which will bring carbon out of the atmosphere and produce products that don't have contaminants that we consume. And the other thing we need is a supply management program so that we don't have gluts and shortages of different commodities. So it's and the other thing is that if we're going to move to organic agriculture, the estimates are we need about 1 million more farmers on the land. We want to get corporate and absentee ownership of the land out. And these industrialized farming practices like the concentrated animal feed operations, which are an environmental disaster and an animal rights disaster.
Yes.
We got to end those. And, you know, animals that we may consume at some point should lead a good life as they see a good life. You know, chickens out scratching, cows out grazing, you know, pigs out rooting. And instead of being in these factories, which are, you know, just abominations in how those animals are treated. And the waste products are a big environmental problem. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Angela.
No, I think you answered it pretty well. And somebody in the Gregory Lloyd is saying in the chat, we must end monocropic agriculture. Absolutely.
It's the only way you can go organic. Monoculture requires pesticides, herbicides, chemical fertilizers, because you deplete the soil, you don't rotate crops. And that's an environmental disaster in itself. We got to restore they call them agroecologies. Our farms should be part of the regional environment and in harmony with it rather than destroying it.
Alex Ludi, or Luddy, if I butchered it, I apologize. What is the campaign's plan to protect and expand our right to organize and strike? We're both folks who come from labor. So we believe in making sure that workers under our administration would be protected. Your right to organize absolutely is protected. Your right to strike is protected. That's, you know, built in to our platform. It's, yeah. How you could like give some more specifics.
Yeah, we need a lot of labor law reform, starting with Taft-Hartley restrictions on the ability to engage in solidarity actions as members of unions or just workers, you know, secondary boycotts, solidarity strikes, honoring picket lines. Political action by unions is restricted. We need to pass card check, which Obama promised in 2 campaigns and then broke the promise in a pretty disrespectful way to the labor movement, I have to say, particularly the second time. Card check means when a majority of workers in a bargaining unit sign a card saying we want to be represented by the union, you're represented. That's just the law. A lot of countries have that. Canada has that. We need a just cause law, which means you cannot be terminated for frivolous reasons. There has to be a just cause so that, you know, the boss can't give your job to his nephew because he just wants to. You can only be discharged for not performing your job correctly or because of economic reasons, and there have to be layoffs. So those are the kinds of labor law reforms we need. And another thing we need, and this goes back to the criminal justice, is we need community control of the police. Police forces, and sometimes National Guard, have been used to break strikes, to protect scabs. And if they're under community control, the people are going to say the workers have a right to organize, and the police should not be used that way. So I think that's another thing that we need to bring back to criminal justice reform, and also recognize that, you know, the police, you know, the first great public employee strike was the Boston police back in 1919. It was in the middle of the Red Scare. And they were working like 100 hours a week, poverty wages, mostly Irish that the WASPs employed, you know, basically to keep the working class down. And they went on strike and they all got fired and replaced. And the labor movement was intimidated to support, you know, solidarity with them. And there was not public employees till 1959, public employees bargaining legally until 1959 in Wisconsin. We lost 40 years there. And meanwhile, the unions are separated from the rest of the labor movement. And that's why we have such a problem with the unions of police officers now. I think that's part of the reason. Of course, the other reason is that we have the police departments that the politicians set up. They do what they do because they were set up to do that. Because behind the politicians is the local power structure and political machine, which is financed by the developers and the real estate industry. And the purpose of the police is to keep downscale people down, particularly Black people, and out of the upscale communities. And that's why Black communities and other communities of color and working class communities are over-policed, and they don't want you in those upscale communities. And so you can be stopped while driving Black because you're in the wrong neighborhood. And that is not breaking any law. That's because that's what the police have been set up to do. That's why we need community control of the police. They need to work for us, not the real estate industry behind the politicians who do the bidding of their paymasters. So,
and I think just to tag on to that, one big thing that, we've been talking about internally about labor itself is that I think it's, time for labor to revisit its socialist, communist roots. And instead of gatekeeping, which has happened at various different times in histories where you've had certain classes of workers that were locked out of being able to be involved in the union. One of those things we're seeing with like all of these folks in the Fight for 15 movement, their right to unionize. So I think that labor in this country is at a point where it needs to take stock of itself and how we're moving and go back to this idea of representing all workers, being a voice for all workers, and this time do it for all workers. Is it Sharon Bamidi? Do not, if I butcher it, just go and correct me. Oh, this is for you, Howie.
Okay, Howie, I hear all the time, student debt was taken by people with full knowledge that they have to repay it. Why should student debt be forgiven? We are not forgiving other types of debt. What do you say to these libertarian folks? Well, education should be a right, not a privilege, particularly in a modern industrial society. And students go into debt trying to better themselves, get a better position in life, or maybe they're just curious and they want to study. And, they want to contribute as scientists or, researchers in social science or literature in the humanities. And sure, they took out their debt, but they did it with the expectation that there'd be a job on the other end that would enable them to repay that debt. And that has not panned out, particularly for the millennial generation and the next generations coming up. But even my generation, I know people on Social Security whose Social Security checks are garnished to pay for old student debts. And right now, the federal government owns 92% of the student debt. It's about $1.6 trillion. And what I would propose is that we have a reasonable payback system where people pay 10% of their income above the poverty line. So nobody's, paying when they're in poverty. And they do that for 20 years. And whatever that is, that's all you pay. And then the rest is forgiven. And I would do that retroactively. So everybody who paid and is still paying on debts, that would be credited toward their debt, even if it was just paying the interest. Because with the government owning so much of the debt, they should not be making money off these loans. The point is to help people get educated. The other thing we want to do is have tuition-free public education at higher, institutions of higher learning or post-secondary, colleges, universities, trade schools, continuing adult education. And another thing we'd like to see is because you can get tuition-free and you still got to support yourself while you're going to college. So people are working and they can't devote, their full time to their studies. And we should do what we did during the post-World War II GI Bill, and that was give people 4 years of living expenses while they went to college. And I think that would be something that would enable students, even if you're going to a public school, you may have to borrow money to cover the rent and your other necessities just because you may want to focus on your studies and not have to work half the time. So I think there's a lot more we could do. And to the libertarians that say, they should pay it, the libertarians have a crazy idea that they're all on an island and the sidewalk they walk to their island to wasn't paid for by everybody. I mean, they just don't have a realistic grasp of reality. And education is a public good, not just something we benefit individually from, because we all benefit from all the knowledge all of us know. That's like our collective wealth. And so, I would say to libertarians, get a closer look, a more realistic look on the world around you, because much of what's around us is a collective product of all of us. Education, the physical environment we live in, and also the problems we have to address. So this individualistic, it's only me and nobody else matters, and I did it all myself, is just baloney. Robin Schultz, hello, I have a question. What is your stance on gun control? Do I have to be scared of you as a gun owner? You want to start with that one, Angela?
Our position on gun control, we believe in honoring the Second Amendment. People do have the right to have sidearms. I personally, because of reasons, I'm somebody that, would have a pistol. That's me. We don't have a problem with that. The issue comes with the having of assault rifles, because you're not hunting with those. Those, serve one purpose, and they kill a lot of people very quickly at one time. So that's something that we don't support as far as gun ownership. Yeah. And I probably stuttered that out. So Howie, go ahead and elaborate.
Yeah, we're willing to live within the framework of the Heller decision, which said you have a right to your personal firearms if you're law-abiding, and the public has the right to regulate in the interest of public safety. So we're for reasonable public regulation, like background checks, and maybe some safety requirements for storing your weapons. And pistols, rifles, shotguns are fine. But as a former Marine, I think military assault rifles should not be on the street and in the public. We should have a buyback program, because as Angela said, a person with bad intentions can kill too many people too fast, and they're just too dangerous. And we have to recognize, even if we recognize people's rights to own their own firearms, that we have a big problem in this country. Our gun violence is off the charts compared to all other industrial countries. It's like we're a war zone. We have gun violence death rates like countries that are actively at war. So the other part of the gun safety issue is, why are people turning to guns to solve problems? And I think that gets back to what Angela was talking about earlier. We got to fight crime by fighting poverty, and fight, they call them deaths of despair. Working class life expectancies are declining because people have lower hopes or their life opportunities were lower than they hoped for and expected. And they turn in on themselves. That's part of this problem of individualism. It's not all their fault that the jobs were shipped to China or Mexico, but they blame themselves and they get angry and they take it out on other people. And so we have senseless gun violence, and we have kids in inner cities that are just hopeless about their prospects and have come up in very difficult circumstances, so that the gang is their family and the gangs are fighting each other. And it's a manhood thing. And they're off in this whole world that wouldn't happen if there were real opportunities. I happen to have gone to college with the people that founded the Vice Lords gang in Chicago back in the late 50s. And these guys, they were not the nicest people. Although the civil rights movement had an impact when King moved the movement north and was working in the west side of Chicago, they're beginning to say to themselves, we got this organization, maybe we should do good with it instead of doing bad. Because they had a lot of petty rackets, selling weed and prostitution and shakedowns. And they started to turn. I ended up going to college with these guys. And when they got to Dartmouth College, an Ivy League school, they totally turned themselves around. They had new opportunities. And that has always convinced me that if we go into these high crime neighborhoods and give these young people opportunities, 99% of them would say, hell yeah, that's much better than what I'm doing now. And then, there's some people that, they got mental issues or emotional issues, and that's a different problem. We got to deal with them a different way. But so we were talking about gun violence, right? Okay, well, I'm saying that gun violence is a social problem that we've got to deal with. The idea that we just take guns from people, that's just going to cause more problems because a lot of people do that. But if we solve the underlying problems, then we're going to have a lot less gun violence.
And like, just to piggyback on what you're saying, because I'm looking in the chat and, there's a couple of people that are like, I am absolutely anti-gun. I live in an area where, I mean, quite frankly, I've been a victim of violence personally. I've known people who have been victimized. And sometimes, well, in all the times that I'm thinking, having a weapon, having a pistol, a sidearm would have been a deterrent to that. And so it's just something, people have the right to have, I was raised with hunting, right? Family was a hunter. We knew where they were. They were stored with the ammunition. None of us bothered them. We knew better. So I've been around weapons my entire life. Howie and I are both prior military, so is our campaign manager. And so it's not like this is something we don't know something about. But people have the right to, I don't disagree with the Second Amendment. And people are saying Canada's very anti-gun and their gun violence. It's also a different culture than the United States. And that's a whole nother discussion within itself. The United States has a violence problem. It has a violence problem going back to its inception. So we need to handle that.
I would summarize up what Angela just said is people have the right to self-defense. And a weapon is sometimes what you need. So we've been here an hour, and so no more questions are coming up on the screen. And I thank everybody for the questions. We've been doing this every Tuesday, and we plan to continue doing this so people can ask us questions and hear what we've got to say. And if you have other thoughts you want to share with us, go to the campaign website, howiehawkins.us, and send us your thoughts. And somebody reads them, and if Angela or I needs to hear them, we will hear them and may respond directly or have somebody respond. And I guess the other thing I'll go back to, we are in a really serious problem right now. We got an idiot for a president. We got a massive pandemic going on out there, and the curves are just going through the roof. And where the hell is Joe Biden? I mean, he could be, like I think I said here, I say it in every interview, he could be calling the White House press corps, and pounding away. Y'all may have seen Andrew Cuomo here in New York, briefing the state on the pandemic and what we were doing about it in New York. That's a model for Joe Biden. He can command them. I may have to go down there myself and try because Biden is AWOL. So we're in a very serious problem here. And while we're dealing with that, we got the background of, like I call it, the centuries-old pandemic of racism and police brutality, the climate meltdown, the inequality crisis, and the new nuclear arms race. And there are more issues. So I just urge people to find a way to be involved in the campaign. And it's a marathon. It's going to continue after Election Day. Pace yourself, but be involved because this won't work unless it's a grassroots mass movement. And so Angela can add to that and finish it off. But I just my last words are, have a good evening and be safe out there.
And I'm going to echo that. Just, I think the biggest thing is just reminding folks that this is bigger than November. And we are going to need each other as far as building an independent independent network on the left. We've got some very big challenges coming up. We're looking at, for educators and families and students, being this federal government is attempting to force people back into the workforce for school during a plague. So we've got a lot of things that we're going to have to handle. So just, y'all stay safe and just remember this is bigger. We want the White House, absolutely. But even more than that, we want to build a coalition to make sure that all of our folks are taken care of.